"You don't belong here," the guard said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of servers behind the glass walls. And just like that, the entire lobby of HelixCore AI shifted. Not louder, not chaotic, but charged, like the air itself had taken a side before anyone else could, because standing right there in front of a biometric scanner worth more than most people's yearly salary was Marcus Hale, dressed in a plain black hoodie, dark denim, and sneakers that had seen better days. Looking less like the man who built the most advanced adaptive learning system in North America, and more like someone who had taken a wrong turn off the street. And yet he didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even blink. He just stood there as the red light on the scanner flickered once, then twice, and finally locked into a cold, unmistakable denial. Access rejected, while behind the glass, rows of neural servers pulsed in steady blue rhythms, unaware, or maybe entirely aware, of who had just been turned away from their core. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Marcus Hale. The guard shifted his stance, one hand resting casually near his belt like this was routine, like this happened every day. Badge, he repeated, slower this time, as if the problem wasn't the system but the man in front of it, as if repeating the word would somehow make Marcus disappear, and for a moment, it almost looked like Marcus might comply, like he might reach into his pocket, pull something out, explain himself, justify his presence in a building that stretched nearly 300,000 square feet across downtown San Jose, a facility he had once walked through when it was nothing but concrete dust and steel beams. But instead, he did something else entirely. He tilted his head slightly, eyes moving, not at the guard, but past him, through the reinforced glass, watching the engineers inside, watching how they moved, who they listened to, who they ignored. The hierarchy written not in titles, but in posture and tone. And then, almost quietly, like a thought spoken out loud, he said, "Systems still lagging on entry validation." And the guard frowned, not because he understood, but because he didn't, because that sentence didn't fit the script he had already decided this moment would follow. "Look," the guard added, a little louder now, drawing the attention of two employees walking by, both slowing just enough to glance over, both making the same quick judgment in less than a second. "Hoodie, no badge, wrong place. You can't just walk in here. This isn't a public space." One of them muttered under his breath, not even trying to hide it, and the other gave a short laugh, the kind that wasn't loud but carried anyway, the kind that spread just enough to let others know something was off, something, or someone, didn't belong. And Marcus heard it. Of course he did. He had heard versions of that laugh at 19 when a recruiter told him he didn't fit the culture. At 24, when a venture capitalist asked who the real technical founder was. At 31, when a board member suggested he step aside for someone with a more familiar presence. And yet here he was, years later, standing outside the very system that now processed over 40 million predictive decisions a day, being told, again, that he didn't belong. And still, he didn't move, didn't argue, didn't defend. He just stood there, calm, steady, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond this glass door, far beyond this guard, far beyond the assumptions filling the space. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have noticed the smallest shift, not in his posture, but in his focus, like a switch had flipped somewhere unseen, like something deep inside the system had just been awakened, quietly, precisely, and completely under his control. Marcus did not reach for a badge because there was none clipped to his hoodie, and that absence seemed to confirm everything the guard already believed as another employee slowed down nearby, pretending to check a tablet, but clearly watching while the red denial light continued to pulse like a verdict already decided, and somewhere behind the glass a set of automatic doors opened for a group of engineers laughing about something trivial, their voices carrying just enough to make the contrast sharper because access for them was effortless, invisible, expected, while for him, it was being questioned at the threshold of his own creation, and the guard exhaled through his nose, shifting his weight again as if patience itself was a favor he was offering. "Last time I am going to say this," he said firmly. "You need proper credentials, or you need to leave." And Marcus finally turned his eyes back to him, not with irritation, not with urgency, but with a kind of measured clarity that made the moment feel slower than it actually was. "What happens?" Marcus asked quietly. "When the system is wrong." The guard gave a short, dismissive shrug. "System is not wrong," he replied quickly. Almost rehearsed. "People are." And that line hung there for a second longer than expected because it sounded less like policy and more like belief, and Marcus let it sit there untouched like evidence being placed on a table. Then he glanced again past the guard toward the interior of the lab, where a wall of monitors displayed real-time adaptive modeling graphs, shifting every fraction of a second, the same system that had been built to learn from error to correct itself, continuously and yet right. Here at the front door, there was no correction, no curiosity, no second check, just a fixed assumption held in place by confidence rather than verification, and one of the engineers inside, a tall man in a pressed shirt, noticed the standoff and walked closer, stopping just inside the glass with a faint smirk. "You lost or something," he said through the door, not loud, but loud enough. "This is restricted access." And another voice chimed in from behind him, probably another walkthrough guy thinking, "This is a demo floor." A few quiet chuckles followed, not aggressive, not explosive, but steady enough to reinforce the line that had already been drawn, and Marcus heard every word the same way he had heard similar ones years ago, standing outside rooms where decisions were made without him, rooms he would later build from the ground up, and still he did not respond to them directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket, slowly, not rushed, not defensive, and pulled out his phone, the movement alone drawing a bit more attention from the small cluster forming nearby, as if they expected a call for help or an attempt to prove something quickly, but Marcus did neither. He unlocked the screen, glanced at it for less than a second, and typed a single line with deliberate precision: "Run internal audit live." No explanation, no second sentence, just that. And then he slipped the phone back into his pocket as if the action itself was insignificant. While inside the building, nothing appeared to change immediately. The monitors kept moving, the engineers kept talking, the guard remained unconvinced, but beneath that surface something had already begun, something quiet, something systemic, because deep within the architecture of HelixCore, the command had not been ignored, it had been recognized, authenticated, and accepted at a level no badge could ever reach. And for the first time since the red light flashed, there was a delay, not visible, not audible, but present in the rhythm of the system itself, like a breath being held before everything shifted. The guard did not notice it at first because nothing visible had changed, and that was the most dangerous kind of shift, the kind that happens beneath the surface where assumptions cannot reach. But inside the lab, a subtle ripple moved across the system dashboards, a delay so small it could have been dismissed as routine latency. Except one person noticed it immediately, a junior engineer standing near the far console. Her name was Emily Carter, 24 years old, 6 months into her first role at HelixCore, and still new enough to question things others had stopped seeing. She leaned closer to her screen, her brow tightening, as a live audit notification blinked once in the corner, not scheduled, not triggered by any department she recognized, just a quiet line of text that read internal audit active root level. And for a moment she hesitated, because root-level access was not something that appeared without clearance, not something that simply happened without someone at the very top initiating it. And she glanced around the room, expecting someone to acknowledge it, but no one did. The others were still half watching the situation at the door, still amused, still confident that whatever was happening outside did not concern them. And the tall engineer near the glass shook his head lightly, as if closing the case in his own mind. "You are holding up access flow," he called out again through the door. "We have work to do." And the guard nodded in agreement, stepping slightly closer to Marcus as if proximity itself would enforce authority. "Sir, I am going to ask you one final time to step away from the entrance." His tone now firmer, less patient, the kind that assumed compliance would follow simply because it always had before. But Marcus did not step back, he did not step forward either. He remained exactly where he was, as if the line drawn between inside and outside no longer held the same meaning for him, and his eyes moved once more across the interior, not searching, not uncertain, but measuring, as if he were watching a process unfold that no one else could see yet. And inside Emily's screen refreshed again, this time slower than before, the graphs hesitating for a fraction of a second before catching up, and that was enough to confirm it. This was not random, this was not a glitch, this was a system-wide observation being executed in real time. And her heart rate picked up, not out of fear, but recognition. because she had studied the architecture long enough to know what this meant. This kind of audit did not just monitor performance, it tracked behavior, access, decisions, authorization. Patterns. It watched everything, including the entry point at the front door, and suddenly the moment outside was no longer isolated. It was part of something larger, something being recorded, evaluated, and she looked up again toward the glass, toward the man in the hoodie, who had not raised his voice, who had not argued, who had simply stood there, and in that stillness something about him did not match the narrative everyone else had already accepted, and she took a step forward almost without realizing it. Her voice quiet at first. Wait. She said, not to Marcus, not to the guard, but to the room itself, and it barely registered until she said it again, stronger this time. Something is running in the system. A few heads turned now, more out of curiosity than concern, and the tall engineer frowned slightly. Then fix it, he replied dismissively, but Emily shook her head, already pulling up deeper logs. I am not authorized to stop this, she said slowly, her eyes scanning the access layer, and then she paused completely, because the identifier attached to the audit was not a department, not a manager, not even the board. It was a single name flagged at a level she had only ever seen in documentation, never in real time, and for a second the room seemed to narrow around that realization, as if everything else had faded just enough to make space for one question she had not yet asked out loud. And outside the door, Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm, almost reflective. You trust the system when it agrees with you, he said quietly. But what happens when it starts telling the truth? And this time no one laughed. The room did not return to normal after Marcus spoke, because something in his voice had shifted the balance without raising the volume. And that kind of control was unfamiliar to people who relied on authority being loud to be effective. And inside the lab, Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she stared at the access tag again, the name still there, unchanged, unchallenged, sitting at the highest level of the system, like it had always belonged there, and her throat tightened slightly as she read it again, silently. Marcus Hale, because she knew that name not from gossip, not from office chatter, but from the onboarding archive, from the origin files, the ones new engineers were told to review, but rarely fully understood. The name attached to the earliest commits to the core adaptive engine, the one credited in the internal documentation as primary architect. And yet here, he was standing outside the glass, being denied by a scanner that reported to the very system he built. And Emily looked up again, this time not with uncertainty, but with urgency. Stop, she said louder now, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. And for the first time the room responded fully, several engineers turning toward her, the tall engineer near the glass frowning more deeply now. What is it, he asked, irritation slipping into his tone, because whatever this was, it was starting to disrupt the rhythm he trusted. But Emily did not answer immediately. She stepped closer to the glass, her eyes locking onto Marcus for a fraction of a second, as if confirming something she already knew, and then she spoke clearly. The audit is running under founder-level authority. And that word founder did something the others had not. It did not create noise, it created silence, because it did not accuse, it did not speculate, it pointed directly at a truth none of them had considered. And the tall engineer blinked once, as if processing a language he had not expected to hear. That is not possible, he said quickly, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty, and Emily shook her head, already pulling the display outward so others could see. It is not just possible, it is active right now, and it is logging access decisions, including this one, she said. And now the room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, visible cracks. A step back here, a glance exchanged there, because systems at this level did not mislabel authority, and they did not run audits without purpose. And outside, the guard straightened again, clearly unaware of the data unfolding behind him. I do not know what game you think you are playing, he said to Marcus, more defensive now than before, but you need to leave the premises. And Marcus finally looked directly at him, not with anger, not with challenge, but with something closer to finality. You already made your decision, he said calmly. Now the system is making its own, and almost on cue. A soft tone echoed from inside the lab, not loud, not alarming, just different enough to pull every eye toward the nearest screen as access panels began refreshing one by one, credentials revalidating in real time, and a thin line of text appeared across multiple monitors simultaneously. System audit, expanding scope, entry control, under review. And the tall engineer took a step back instinctively, as if distance might restore control. What is happening? Someone whispered from the back of the room. But no one answered because the answer was already forming in front of them, and Emily felt it settle into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And she spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow stronger. "He is not trying to get in," she said, her eyes still on Marcus. "He is checking who should not be in." And that was the moment the glass between them stopped feeling like a barrier and started feeling like evidence. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt loaded, like a system waiting for confirmation. And inside the lab, the monitors no longer refreshed at their usual rhythm. Instead, they pulsed in staggered intervals, as if prioritizing something unseen. And Emily could feel it now, not just as a technical anomaly, but as a shift in authority, one that did not ask permission before asserting itself. And she swallowed hard as she navigated deeper into the audit logs, her fingers moving faster, now pulling up access histories, reviewing entry denials and approvals in real time. And what she saw made her pause again, because the system was not only logging what was happening at the door, it was cross-referencing it against behavioral patterns, past incidents, flagged inconsistencies that had never been escalated before, and one by one small indicators began appearing beside certain profiles, quiet warnings that had never surfaced until now. And behind her, the tall engineer stepped closer, his earlier confidence thinning into something more cautious. "Let me see that," he said, but there was less command in his voice this time, and more need. And Emily hesitated for just a second before angling the screen toward him, and as his eyes scanned the data, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to break the certainty he had been holding on to, because the system did not lie, not at this level, not when it was running at root authority. And outside, the guard cleared his throat louder, now trying to reclaim control of a situation that no longer responded to his tone. "Sir, you are interfering with a secured facility," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "If you do not leave, I will escalate this." And Marcus nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like someone noting a step in a process already accounted for. "You already escalated it," he replied calmly, and the words did not land as a challenge, they landed as fact. And for a moment the guard seemed unsure how to respond, because escalation usually meant calling someone higher, but there was no one higher responding, yet only silence from the system that normally confirmed his authority instantly. And that silence stretched just long enough to feel unfamiliar. And inside, Emily's screen updated again, this time highlighting a specific sequence: entry denial, log manual override, not attempted, behavioral bias flag, confidence threshold exceeded. And she felt a chill move through her, because the system was not just tracking access, it was evaluating judgment, the decision itself being analyzed against expected protocol. And then something else appeared, a timestamp from just minutes ago tied directly to the front entry point, and beneath it a line that made her inhale sharply: recommendation. Review immediate. And she looked up again toward Marcus, standing exactly where he had been from the beginning, unchanged, unmoved, as if none of this required his intervention anymore, because the system was now speaking for him. And she remembered something from her first week, a line buried in the original architecture notes, written not like documentation, but like a principle: the system is not designed to follow power, it is designed to reveal it. And suddenly that sentence no longer felt theoretical. It felt present, unfolding in real time. And behind her someone whispered, "Is this about him?" But no one answered, because the answer was already forming in the data, in the silence, in the shift of posture across the room. And outside, Marcus finally took a single step forward, not crossing the threshold, but close enough that the sensor flickered again, uncertain this time, not fully rejecting, not fully accepting, just waiting. And he looked at the guard one last time, his voice steady. "You trusted the badge more than the system," he said quietly. "That is why you missed the truth." And for the first time since this began, the guard did not respond immediately, because somewhere in the building the system had already begun deciding what happened next. The delay at the scanner stretched just long enough to feel intentional, and that was when the system stopped behaving like a passive tool and started acting like an active presence, because the red light did not flash again immediately. Instead, it dimmed for a fraction of a second, as if recalibrating its own certainty. And inside the lab, every screen updated at once, not with alarms, not with warnings, but with clarity: lines of data, reorganizing priorities, shifting access logs, expanding into full behavioral timelines. And Emily stepped back slightly as the scope widened beyond the entry point into internal credentials, cross-department permissions, and historical overrides that had never been questioned before. And one by one names began to highlight across the system, not as errors, but as patterns, subtle inconsistencies that only became visible when viewed together, and the tall engineer's voice came out lower, now stripped of its earlier edge. "Why is it pulling everything?" he asked, but the question did not carry authority anymore. It carried uncertainty, because this was no longer a localized check. This was a full system introspection, and outside, the guard reached toward his radio, hesitating just before pressing it, because for the first time the instinct to escalate met something unfamiliar: resistance, not from Marcus, but from the silence of the system that had always confirmed his actions instantly, and now offered nothing. No green light, no reinforcement, just absence. And Marcus watched it all unfold without shifting his stance, his presence steady, like someone who had already seen this outcome play out long before this moment. And he spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "There is a difference between access and authority," he said calmly. "One is given, the other is built." And the words settled into the space like a line that separated what they thought they controlled from what they actually understood. And inside, Emily navigated deeper into the audit, her screen now showing layered access hierarchies, and at the very top, a single root identifier controlling the cascade beneath it, not through commands being issued in real time, but through permissions that had always existed waiting to be exercised. And her voice came out almost as a realization spoken aloud. "It is not just auditing us," she said quietly. "It is validating itself." And that statement shifted the room again, because it meant the system was not reacting, it was confirming something it already knew, and as if in response, a new line appeared across multiple displays: system authority, confirmed, founder-level access verified, and the words did not blink. They did not hesitate. They settled into place with finality, and several engineers stepped back instinctively, as if distance might restore the structure they were used to, but the structure had already changed. And outside, the scanner finally responded, not with rejection, but with recognition, the red light fading into a steady neutral glow, the barrier between inside and outside no longer asserting denial, but waiting for alignment. And the guard lowered his hand from the radio slowly, his posture no longer firm but uncertain, because the system he trusted had stopped supporting his decision. And Marcus took one more step forward, this time not testing the boundary, but approaching it as if it had already been cleared. And he paused just short of crossing, looking once more at the guard, whose certainty had dissolved into hesitation. And then he said quietly, "You enforced a rule without understanding who wrote it." And before the guard could answer, before anyone inside could react, the doors behind the glass released with a soft, controlled sound, unlocking not because they were told to open, but because the system had finally aligned with the truth it had recognized from the beginning. The doors did not swing open dramatically, they parted with quiet precision, like a system correcting itself, and that subtle movement carried more weight than any alarm ever could, because it was not reacting, it was confirming. And Marcus stepped forward without hesitation, crossing the threshold that had just denied him minutes ago, as if the barrier had never truly existed. And inside the lab, the atmosphere shifted instantly, not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because every screen, every terminal, every active process had already aligned with his presence. And Emily felt it before she fully understood it, the change in how the system responded, the way permissions reorganized in real-time, pathways opening without friction, commands executing without delay, as if the entire architecture had been waiting for this exact moment to return to its original state. And the tall engineer near the glass took a step back, unconsciously clearing space, not out of respect yet, but out of instinct, because something about Marcus's presence no longer matched the assumptions they had built around him. And Marcus did not rush. He walked at a steady, measured pace through the lab, his eyes moving across the room, not searching for validation, but observing everything: the posture of the engineers, the layout of the consoles, the way authority had been distributed in practice rather than in design. And he stopped near the central control display, where the audit logs were still unfolding in real time, layers of data revealing patterns that had been invisible just minutes ago. And he placed his hand lightly on the edge of the console, not to claim it, but to steady the moment. And then he spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut through the tension without effort. "I built this system to remove bias from decisions," he said, his voice even, not to automate it. And the words landed harder than any accusation, because they did not target individuals, they exposed a pattern. And no one responded immediately, because the evidence was already in front of them in the logs, in the flagged behaviors and the decisions that had been made without verification. and Emily felt her breath catch slightly as she realized the full scope of what had been revealed. This was not a single incident. This was a chain, a series of choices reinforced over time until they became invisible, and Marcus turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, settling briefly on each person, not with judgment, but with recognition, as if he understood exactly how this had happened without excusing it. And then he said the words that ended any remaining doubt. "I am Marcus Hale," he stated calmly, founder and chief executive officer of HelixCore. And the room did not erupt. It did not react with shock in any outward way. It simply went still, because the truth did not need amplification. It carried its own weight, and the tall engineer's shoulders lowered slightly, as if something inside him had just recalibrated, while the guard at the door remained frozen, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet realization that had no immediate response. And the system behind them continued its audit, uninterrupted screens, updating logs, finalizing evaluations, and for the first time since this began, no one questioned it, no one challenged it, because the authority driving it was no longer abstract. It was standing in the room, and Marcus looked once more at the central display before speaking again, his voice steady. "This was never about access," he said. "It was about who you believed deserved it." And in that moment, the system was no longer just a tool. It was a mirror reflecting every decision back to the people who made them. No one moved at first, because movement would have required certainty, and certainty had just been taken out of the room piece by piece by the very system they trusted and now feared to question. And the screens continued to update, not faster, not louder, just more complete, as the audit reached its final layers, pulling together every flagged decision, every ignored inconsistency, every moment where assumption had replaced verification. And Marcus stood at the center of it all, not elevated, not distant, just present, as if this outcome had always been part of the design. And Emily watched the logs finalize one by one, her eyes tracking the changes as system permissions began to shift in real-time, access levels recalibrating, roles being reevaluated not through manual command, but through the authority already embedded at the highest level. And a notification appeared across the central display: employment status under review, compliance verification in progress. And the words carried a weight that no one could ignore, because this was not a warning, this was a consequence unfolding exactly as the system had been built to execute. And the tall engineer swallowed subtly, his gaze dropping to the console as his credentials refreshed, and for a brief second his access tier flickered before stabilizing at a lower level than before. And that single shift said more than any explanation could. While across the room, two other engineers saw similar changes, their permissions narrowing, their system reach reduced, not as punishment, but as correction. And the realization settled in slowly. This was not about removing people, it was about aligning them with the standard they had failed to uphold. And near the entrance, the guard's device buzzed softly, drawing his attention downward as he looked at the screen and saw his own status update: pending review, access privileges temporarily restricted. And he did not speak, he did not argue, because the system he had trusted had now evaluated him with the same impartial logic he had assumed only applied to others. And Marcus finally moved again, stepping closer to the central display, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind the data streams, and he rested his hand lightly against the console, not as a gesture of control, but of completion. And then he spoke, his voice calm, steady, carrying across the room without force. "The system did exactly what it was designed to do," he said. "It observed, it recorded, and it corrected." And the words did not accuse, they clarified, leaving no space for misinterpretation. And Emily felt something shift inside her, not fear, not relief, but understanding, because she could see now what the system had revealed: not just errors, but patterns, not just actions, but intent shaped over time. And Marcus turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the group near the glass, including the tall engineer who no longer met his eyes, and then toward the entrance where the guard stood, still processing a reality he had not expected to face. And Marcus's voice lowered slightly, but remained clear. "You were not judged by who you thought you were," he said. "You were evaluated by what you actually did." And that distinction settled deeper than any reprimand, because it removed all defense, all narrative, leaving only the truth of the moment. And one final update appeared across the screens: audit complete, system integrity restored. And with it, the tension that had filled the room began to dissolve, not because everything was resolved, but because everything was now visible. And Marcus stepped back from the console, giving the system space to settle. into its corrected state, and for the first time since he entered, no one questioned his presence, no one challenged his authority, because it was no longer something to prove, it was something the system itself had confirmed beyond doubt. The room did not return to what it was before, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and the system had made everything visible, not through noise, not through force, but through precision, and Marcus stood quietly as the final processes settled, the glow of the monitors returning to their steady rhythm, the same rhythm they had before, but now carrying a different meaning, because everyone in that space understood that what had just happened was not an interruption, it was a correction. And Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as the weight of uncertainty gave way to something more grounded, a recognition that the system she had studied was not just powerful, it was principled, and for the first time, she looked at Marcus not as a figure of authority, but as the origin of that principle. And across the room the engineers adjusted, not dramatically, not with sudden apologies, but with subtle shifts in posture, in attention, in awareness, because the standard had been raised without a single demand being made. And near the entrance the guard stepped back slightly, his stance no longer defensive, no longer certain, just present as he processed the outcome without argument, because there was nothing left to argue against. And Marcus turned from the central display, his gaze moving once more across the room, not lingering, not searching for acknowledgement, just observing the space as it settled into its corrected state. And then he spoke one final time, his voice calm, measured, carrying the same quiet authority it had from the beginning. "This place was never meant to keep people out," he said. "It was built to make sure the right doors open for the right reasons." And the words did not challenge anyone, they reframed everything. And in that moment the concept of access shifted from something enforced to something earned, not through appearance, not through assumption, but through alignment with the values embedded in the system itself. And Marcus paused briefly before continuing, his tone steady, unwavering. "I did not come here to prove who I am," he said. "I came here to see if the system still reflects what it was built on." And that statement settled deeper than anything else, because it removed the focus from him entirely and placed it back on the structure they all operated within. And the implication was clear: the system had passed its test, but not everyone inside it had. And yet there was no anger in his voice, no need to escalate, because the outcome had already been delivered by the system itself, fair, complete, and undeniable. And Marcus took a step toward the exit, not rushed, not lingering, simply moving forward as if his presence was no longer required for the process to continue. And as he passed by Emily, their eyes met for just a brief second, not long enough for words, but long enough for understanding, and she gave a small nod, almost instinctive, acknowledging not just who he was, but what he had just done. And Marcus returned that acknowledgement with the slightest tilt of his head before continuing on. And as the doors opened for him, without hesitation, this time responding instantly to his presence, the contrast from earlier did not need to be explained, it spoke for itself. And he stepped through without looking back, leaving behind a room that was no longer the same, not because it had been disrupted, but because it had been realigned. And as the doors closed quietly behind him, the system continued to run, not as a silent authority, but as a living standard, one that did not require volume to enforce it, only truth to sustain it. And in the stillness that followed, one thing became clear to everyone who remained: he had not raised his voice, he had raised the standard, and the system had made sure it stayed that way.